And with that, we can now again send our HTTP request through JavaScript. For this, we again use the fetch function, and we now again need to construct the path to which we want to send this request. If we have a look at our routes, we see that it's this post route that we want to reach. So the path should be /posts, then the concrete ID of the post, and then /comments. So the same path as up here, but now it should be a post instead of a GET request. So what we can do actually is we can use this path, which we constructed earlier, and copy this down there here, and use that. And again construct our post ID here. Copy this code, and also add this here to save comment. Now to get the post ID, we can actually still reach out to the load comments button element, but alternatively, we can also add that post ID to another element, for example, to the form itself. Here, we could also add data post ID and also set this equal to post._ID, so that we have the ID of the post for which we want to add comments directly on the form. And then we could use this data set here in the comments.js file and use the comments form element .dataset.postID to get the post ID. And then this would send a request here. However, now sending a request like this is not enough anymore. Before, this was great because fetch by default sends a GET request, and that is what I did want to do here in fetch comments for post. But now I want to send a post request instead. And even though the name fetch doesn't imply it, the fetch function cannot just be used for fetching data, but actually for sending any kind of HTTP request, including post requests. All you have to do to switch from a GET to a POST request is you have to add a second parameter value to the fetch function after the URL, and that second value is an object in which you can now set different properties. Different properties the fetch function will be looking for to configure the fetch function's behavior. For example, you can set a method property, and this has to be named method because JavaScript, browser-side JavaScript, will look for this key when the fetch function executes. And by default, this is set to get, so to a string saying get, but you can also set it to post to instead send a post request. And that's what I want to do here. Now, a post request then also needs the data that should be sent with it. And before, we didn't have to worry about that because the browser sent post requests automatically for us. Now that we are writing our own code, we also have to add our own data to the outgoing request here. And we do this with another field here, and that's the body field. Here we set the body of the outgoing request. And that should now be again data in the JSON format. Because as mentioned before, that is the common data format for exchanging data when using AJAX. Hence here, we want to send a new JavaScript object converted to JSON. So we can create our comment here, for example, and include a title, which is our entered title, and the text, which is our entered text. And now I want to convert this object to JSON. For this, we can use the built-in JSON object. We actually used it before on the server side in earlier course sections. It's also available here on the browser side, so in browser side JavaScript code. And this JSON object, which is built into the browser, has two utility methods. One method for parsing JSON content, so for converting JSON to raw JavaScript values, and then stringify for doing the opposite, so for encoding JavaScript values into JSON. And that's what we need here, because I want to convert my comment JavaScript object into JSON, which looks very similar, but is not quite the same as you learned before. You have all these double quotes, and in the end, JSON is just text formatted in a certain way. This JavaScript object here is a special object, a special data type used in our JavaScript execution here. So it's a different thing. Now here we converted it, and now with that we configured this request to actually be a POST request. Now we do send this to our server, and there we now want to handle this incoming data. That means that in block.js, so in our server-side routes, we now also want to work on this POST route again. Up to this point, this POST route extracts some data from the incoming request and from the URL path, and then adds a new comment in our MongoDB collection. And actually that code should still work, but there is a tiny gotcha here. When we extract data from the request body, we currently only do that if the request body is URL encoded. You might remember this term. If you have a look at app.js, where we register some middleware, we added this URL encoded middleware for parsing all incoming requests for data that might be attached to them. Well, this will work, but it only looks for data that is URL encoded, which is the encoding format if a form is submitted. That's not what is happening here. We are preventing that default after all. We are instead sending JSON data. Now, thankfully, Express has a built-in middleware that will also parse JSON data though. All we have to do here is use another middleware in addition to the URL encoded middleware, and that's Express JSON, also executed as a function here. This will parse all incoming requests and see if they are in the JSON format, and if they are, it will then parse that JSON data for us. So by adding this middleware, we are able to handle incoming requests that were sent by the browser, where a regular form was submitted, and we're able to handle incoming requests that use the JSON format, which is the kind of format we're using for this request here now. And with that back in our block.js file, in our routes here, this code here actually should still work. Because when we use this JSON middleware, we will still have a rec body field that holds the parsed content of the incoming request. So this doesn't change. We just needed to add that middleware to parse the content in the first place. The only thing that has to change here now is the response. I no longer want to redirect. Instead, I now want to send back some data once we're done. So I want to send back some JSON data. And here, of course, I'm not fetching any data, so I don't really need to, send back any data that's coming from a database. But we could send back an object, which is converted to JSON automatically by this method, where we simply set a message to comment added. It's up to you which data you want to send back. You could also send back an empty object to not send back any data at all. But you want to send some response to signal that you're done and that the request was handled. And now, back in comments.js, we can of course again wait for this response. Though actually we don't even have to do that if we're not really doing anything with the response, and we're not doing anything here because the response doesn't contain anything we need. We of course don't necessarily have to wait for it. We can just send this request and forget about it here on the front end. The comment should still be added to the database. So therefore, long story short, if we save all our files with all these changes made, and we reload this page here, if I add a new comment here, send via Ajax, and I click Save Comment, we don't get any feedback here, so that's something we might want to change. But if I load my comments, I get it here, though clearly something went wrong because I only see null, null. So storing the data failed. Though I got no error here, so the server didn't crash. Still, something is not working. We can also confirm this if we manually use the Mongo shell to have a look at all the comments. What we see is that here I got a comment, but the title and text is missing. So what's going on here? Well, actually, one important step is missing still. We did add this middleware here in app.js to parse incoming JSON data. But how do these parsing middlewares work in the first place? They actually don't try to simply parse all incoming request bodies and see if it works or not. Instead, what they do is they look at the headers of the incoming requests, so at some extra metadata which is attached to them, and that metadata should contain information about the encoding of the request body. And if the metadata says that it's URL encoded, this middleware will become active. If the metadata says that it's JSON encoded, this middleware will become active. If the metadata doesn't say either of the two things, no middleware. So none of these two middlewares will become active. And that's exactly what's happening here. We didn't set any metadata on this outgoing request, and hence the body isn't actually being parsed on our backend code. For the requests sent automatically by the browser, for example when a form is submitted, the browser did set that metadata for us. Here, since we sent the request ourselves, we have to do that ourselves. And just to quickly see that, you can go back to the front end, to the developer tools, and there to the network tab. And here, if you inspect this second to last request, which was this post request, you can see the headers that were attached to the request. So you can check the request headers. And in there you see a bunch of metadata, which is added automatically. So that's really all just metadata automatically added by the browser for this outgoing request. But since the browser didn't create the request, the browser did not add any metadata describing the kind of content we're sending. And therefore that's something we need to do ourselves. Here in the front-end code in comments.js, we add an extra piece of configuration to this fetch function, and that's the headers property. We can set this to a JavaScript object to define some extra headers, some extra pieces of metadata that should be attached to the outgoing request. And this metadata always has a key value format. You have a header name and then a value for the header. And whilst you can add any headers of your choice, there are a bunch of predefined headers which are commonly used. For example, here, what we need to set is the content-type header, written like this. I put it between single quotes because it contains a dash, and without quotes, this would be an invalid property name here in JavaScript. So we need the quotes around it. Content type is a special header, which is exactly the header the app.js file, so these middlewares, will look for. And it was missing thus far. So now we add it, and now after a colon, we set the value for this content type. And here we should set this to application/JSON. That's a reserved identifier for saying that we add JSON data to this request. So this line here, this header being added, says that this request carries some JSON data. So now to check this, let's go back to the Mongo shell quickly and actually delete this comment here by executing db comments delete 1. And then I want to look for the comment where the ID is equal to object ID and then this comment. So now this comment which was broken was deleted. And if we now reload our post page here, if I add another comment, another test sent via Ajax, and I then load my comments, now the data is here. Because now it's stored in the database, as you can see if I again get all my comments, because now it was parsed successfully on the backend, because we told our server which kind of data was attached to this incoming request by adding this extra piece of metadata, this extra header, to this outgoing request. And therefore, you can tell it's a bit more work, But it's also in the end not too difficult to send a POST request to the server. And now we are again sending a request behind the scenes without reloading the page, and we can then handle it on the server and send back a response. Now we're not doing anything when we get this response here, but sending the request works. So let's now have a look at different options we have for using the response and maybe improving the overall user experience, which we have here.